One of my favorite elements of the Christmas season is all of the different Christmas-themed movies and TV specials and things like that. I know it's probably surprising to you that the movies would be one of my favorite part of the Christmas season. I've shared my love of film with you guys before, but something about Christmas is just, there's a Christmas movie for anyone. There's all kinds of different genres. There's Christmas-themed scary movies. There's Christmas-themed comedies. There's Christmas-themed feel-good. Hallmark makes a living off of making Christmas-themed romantic movies. If you really want to watch the same movie 18 different times play out. But there's something for everyone, no matter who you are, no matter how old you are, no matter what generation you come from, there is a Christmas movie that is probably one of your favorites. Whether that be something like It's a Wonderful Life to A Christmas Story, or maybe White Christmas to Elf, or maybe Home Alone to Die Hard. Everybody has their own favorite Christmas movie, their own favorite holiday movie. And as much as I love these movies, and I would spend all night talking about them if you'd let me, I want to really bring to your attention a movie that, well, isn't a Christmas movie. In fact, Christmas doesn't even play any sort of a part in the plot. It's not even mentioned, I don't think, throughout the entire film. It's not even a beloved classic. In fact, it's a movie you may have never heard of before. It's a little independent film called Get Low. Get Low is a movie that while it may have had a small budget, somehow they were able to pull off getting two major Hollywood stars. It stars Robert Duvall and Bill Murray. In the film, Murray plays a funeral director for a small town where it seems like nobody ever passes away. And if you're a funeral director, that's not exactly great for business. And so he's kind of struggling. His whole business is on the verge of bankruptcy, and he doesn't know how he's going to continue to turn the lights on even. And so it kind of makes sense why when Robert Duvall's character enters into his funeral home with a unique offer, that Murray would take it. Robert Duvall plays the town hermit. He's kind of cut himself off. He doesn't talk to anybody unless he absolutely has to. He really only comes into town to get his groceries and to do some things for his town or to sell some of the things that he's got. But Robert Duvall owns a large farm property that's just outside of town. And even though he doesn't really have any friends or anybody that he talks to in this town, everybody in town knows him. And everybody in town has a story about him, most of them untrue. He has kind of created or developed this legend about himself, and different people think that maybe he did something terrible in his past and that's why he doesn't talk to anybody. Some people think he's just weird or maybe does unusual things out on his farm that he doesn't want anybody to know about. So he just kind of has built this legend around himself simply by choosing not to socialize with people. But one day Robert Duvall enters Bill Murray's funeral home, and when he does, he offers Bill Murray a huge sum of money, a practically life-changing sum of money. And he says that he wants to go ahead and pay for his funeral now. Now, this sort of thing isn't overly uncommon. I mean, I think it happens from time to time. But Robert Duvall has a rather large string attached to this. See, he wants to be there for his funeral. And he's not just talking about he wants to be in a casket at his funeral. He wants to be present at his funeral. Robert Duvall says that he wants to have his funeral while he's still alive. And he wants everybody from town to come out, to come be a part of it. And he wants them to share the stories that they've heard about him throughout town. He wants to know what people are saying about him behind his back. He wants to know why people are so interested in him as a person. And to kind of make sure that everybody from town actually comes to this thing, because it's an unusual proposition, Robert Duvall tells Bill Murray he's willing to raffle off his land, that people can buy a ticket for $5, and as long as they come and they share their story about Robert Duvall's character, then they'll be entered to win his entire property. He's not going to sell it. He's going to give it to somebody. Needless to say, this whole notion and this whole ordeal is too fantastic for the townspeople to miss. And when the day of his funeral comes, it really doesn't feel like a funeral. If anything, it feels more like, well, a party. And without giving away the ending to this amazingly pivotal scene, nothing about this funeral feels like a funeral. And if you see the movie, or if you have seen the movie, then you might understand this, but it's such a unique scene that it is easy for you as the viewer to forget that this is supposed to be a funeral. You can get so caught up in the energy and the dialogue and the acting that's going on that you forget that this is supposed to be the sort of thing where we talk about somebody who's died. It doesn't feel like a funeral, it feels like a party. And I mean, what makes this scene so unusual is who would have a party for somebody who's supposed to die? And yet, that's exactly what we're doing in the midst of this whole thing. Tonight, we celebrate, we commemorate the birth of someone who was born to die. And it's easy for us to kind of lose that notion in all the lights and the glamour and the gifts and the festivities that sometimes become associated with this season. We kind of forget that we're celebrating the birth of Jesus, a baby who was born to die. We know that he was born so that one day he could go to the cross. Everything about the Christmas season takes place in the shadow of the cross. And yet, it's a season that we choose to celebrate. We have parties. Well, any other year we have parties, and we do all sorts of traditions and fun things, and we string up amazing lights, and we just kind of go all out in the celebration of this day. But this is for a child who was born to die. So it begs the question, why do we so look forward to commemorating this day? Why do we so look forward? Why do we get so excited whenever it becomes time for the Christmas season? Why do we celebrate Christmas when the shadow of the cross looms over it? How do we have a party for someone who's going to die? And really the answer is because that's what all of heaven did. And so maybe to understand why we celebrate Christmas the way that we do, and why do we celebrate it with such lavishness and get so excited whenever the calendar turns to December, maybe to answer that, we need to try to, as hard as we can as human beings, to look at the Christmas story from the perspective of heaven. And frankly, to do that, we're going to need to go further back than this night. See, when God first shaped the world, when he went through the entire creation ordeal and he formed humanity and he did so differently than what he'd done any other creation that he had done. And the creation narrative in Genesis tells us that God spoke everything else into existence, but when it came to creating man, he gathered us up. He formed us from the dust of the world, like an artist sculpting something amazing. And when he had finally finished everything out just perfectly, again, he did something different than what he had done with any other creation. He breathed life into us. So right away from the very beginning, God had a special relationship with humanity. It was unlike any other thing that he had created. And when creation took place, and it's just God and man, and it's God and man and woman and everything, it was perfect. And not the kind of perfection that we look forward to in our lives, not the kind of thing that we think, oh, well, that's perfect. No, we're talking perfect. There was no pain. There was no misery. There was no suffering. There was no heartache. There were no tears. There was no death. It was God and people together in perfect harmony. There was nothing to cause any sort of sever or separation to that relationship. We knew God, and not just knew about God, and not just had facts that we could recite about God, and not just knew memory verses about God. We knew God intimately, deeply, closely. It's a deeper level of relationship with God than you and I, frankly, could ever imagine. But selfishly, perfection didn't seem to be enough for us. And yeah, we can try to throw blame on the tempter. We could try to say, well, it was the snake's fault. It was Satan's fault. We could do all that. But the reality of the situation is that when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, they made that decision for themselves. And I think realistically, if we're honest, we probably would have too. It was the one thing that God told them not to do. And they did it anyway. And when that happened, in this one stupid, simple, gut-wrenching moment, everything changed. Perfection was tarnished forever. Sin entered the equation. And it opened the gates to a whole host of consequences that were not part of the plan that God originally had for this world. Because when sin entered the world, it brought with it pain and fear and misery and even death. And probably worst of all, the most offensive thing that sin brought with it was it severed the connection between God and man. For the first time since creation had been started, God and man were no longer together. The relationship had been changed entirely. A holy God could not be around unholy sin. And immediately God knew that he wanted that connection back. That his love for us was so deep that the minute that connection gets severed, he wants to put a plan in place to fix it. He loved us so desperately that the very moment when we invited that separation between God and us, God knew he needed to fix it. But it really wasn't that simple. It wasn't like God could just snap his fingers and instantaneously the sin would be removed. It wasn't like God could just forget about our sin. It wasn't like God could just ignore our sin being there. In order for that relationship between God and man to be restored, it meant that sin had to be removed completely. It had to be wiped out entirely. But the only way for sin to truly be gone, for it to truly leave the equation, it meant that something or someone would have to die. That person or that thing would need to become the embodiment of sin. And then its life ended. So that sin could be removed, so that God and man could have that connection restored. But who or what could possibly be sacrifice enough to not just wipe out the sins of a few, but to wipe out the sin of all? Who could possibly take on the sin of not just that one person, but the sin of all people throughout time? Who could possibly be that perfect of a sacrifice? The answer was obvious, but it was far from easy. The only one who could possibly be sacrificed enough to wipe the slate clean for all time would have to be the Son of God himself, the Lamb, the Word. In order for the relationship between God and man to be restored, it meant that God's only Son would have to die. He would have to become the sacrifice in our place. So a plan was put into motion. The Son of God would come to this world as a man, because the only way that he can truly absolve man of their sins is to become man himself. And he would be born with the sole purpose of one day becoming that sacrifice. For one day dying for the sins of all man. It wasn't the easiest notion in the world. I mean, God didn't exactly love the idea of his son being born solely to die. But if it meant that man and God could have their connection back, that wonderful connection that they had for all too fleeting a moment, if it meant that that relationship could be restored, then it was a price worth paying. It was a high price, to be sure, but a worthy price nonetheless. And so that night, when the Son of God became flesh and bone, when Jesus came forth into the world, heaven erupted into celebration. Yeah, they knew that this was meant, or what he was meant to do. They knew that in short order he would be killed. And not just any death, it would be one of the most brutal deaths that any human being could ever endure. But they celebrated nonetheless. Their celebration was so great that they allowed a small part of humanity to actually be a part of it. They invited some very unusual guests to their party because a group of common, ordinary shepherds were allowed to see a multitude of the heavenly hosts with the angel praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to people he favors." Yes, it meant that Jesus was going to die, but heaven still partied. They still celebrated. Because they knew, they understood that this baby who would grow into a man who would die for the sins of all would set everything in creation right again. His death meant the restoration of God and man. Jesus himself would eventually explain why this was all cause for celebration when he said, "For God loved the world in this way. He gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life." This one death meant the restoration of all. That is good news. That is the gospel. That is Christmas.